The telegram arrived at noon on the hottest day of June 1885, and Nathan Murphy knew she was desperate when she agreed to come all the way to Genoa, Nevada, without asking more questions. He stood on the platform of the small depot, watching the train release its steam into the dry desert air, and wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. His ranch needed help, that much was true, but hiring a woman sight unseen based solely on a letter of recommendation from his late mother's sister felt reckless even by his standards. When Nora Mitchell stepped down from the passenger car, dust coating the hem of her plain brown traveling dress, she looked nothing like what he expected. She was tall for a woman, nearly matching his own 5'10", with dark auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of sage after rain. She carried a single worn carpetbag and moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to make herself small in a world that preferred women to stay that way. "Miss Mitchell," he called out, removing his hat. She turned toward him, and he saw exhaustion etched into the fine lines around her eyes. "Mr. Anderson, Murphy," he corrected gently. "Michael Murphy. I think there might have been some confusion in the correspondence." Color rose in her cheeks. "I apologize." The letters became rather jumbled toward the end. "Your mother's sister, Mrs. Crawford, she mentioned you needed help with the household for the summer months." "That is correct," Michael said, taking her bag without asking permission. She started to protest, but seemed to think better of it. "The ranch is about an hour's ride from here. I have a wagon waiting." They walked toward the main street where his buckboard stood tethered to a post outside the general store. Genoa sprawled before them, a small settlement tucked against the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, where Mormon Station had once stood decades earlier. The town served ranchers and travelers heading west, and though it was not as lawless as some Nevada towns, it still carried that raw edge of frontier life. "I should tell you what the work entails," Michael said as he helped her onto the wagon seat. His hands were careful around her waist proper, and he released her the moment she was settled. "My ranch runs about 300 head of cattle. I have 2 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse, but they handle the outdoor work. What I need is someone to manage the house, prepare meals, tend the vegetable garden, and handle the domestic duties. My mother passed last winter and my father before her 3 years ago. I have been managing alone, but the place has gotten away from me." Nora nodded, her hands folded primly in her lap. "I can do all of that. I was in service in San Francisco before taking care of my aunt in her final illness. When she passed 2 months ago, I found myself without a position. Mrs. Crawford's letter came at a fortunate time." "You did not wish to stay in San Francisco?" "There was nothing holding me there," she said simply, and something in her tone suggested she would not welcome further questions on the subject. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking along the rutted road that led into the valley. The landscape stretched wide and gold around them, sagebrush rolling toward distant mountains still capped with snow despite the summer heat. Hawks circled overhead, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. "It is beautiful here," Nora said softly, surprising him. "Severe but beautiful." "It grows on you," Michael agreed, "or it drives you away. There is not much middle ground." When they reached the ranch, he watched her face carefully for disappointment. The house was solid, built of wood his father had hauled down from the mountains, with a wide porch and a stone chimney. But he knew it showed neglect. The paint had weathered to gray in places, the garden was overgrown with weeds, and the windows needed washing. Still, Nora's expression did not change. She simply climbed down from the wagon and surveyed her new domain with the same careful dignity she had shown at the station. "The hands eat in the bunkhouse," Michael explained, carrying her bag toward the front door. "You would only be cooking for the two of us, though you are welcome to prepare extra if you wish to be generous. Their names are Tom and Ricardo. Good men, both of them. They will not bother you." "I am not worried," Nora said, and he believed her. He showed her through the house, pointing out the kitchen with its cast iron stove, the parlor where dust motes danced in the afternoon light, the bedroom upstairs that would be hers. His own room was downstairs, off the kitchen, a fact he mentioned specifically so she would know she had privacy. "I will leave you to settle in," he said, setting her bag on the narrow bed. "Supper is usually around 7, but tonight I can manage something simple if you need time to rest." "Nonsense," Nora said, already removing her traveling jacket. "I will have something ready by 7. It may not be fancy, but it will be hot and filling." Michael nodded and backed out of the room, suddenly aware of how intimate it felt to be standing in a bedroom with a woman he had just met. He retreated downstairs and out to the barn, where he found Tom and Ricardo mending tack. "She arrive?" Tom asked. He was a weathered man in his 50s, all leather and sinew, who had worked for Michael's father before Michael inherited the place. "She did." "Pretty." Ricardo grinned, showing the gap in his front teeth. He was younger, maybe 30, with the dark eyes and quick smile of his Mexican heritage. "That is not relevant to her ability to cook," Michael said firmly. But he felt heat creep up his neck anyway because, yes, Nora Mitchell was striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness, and everything to do with the intelligence in her eyes and the straight line of her spine. That night, Nora served beef stew with dumplings, biscuits that were somehow both light and filling, and dried apple pie made from supplies she had found in the pantry. Michael ate in silence, trying not to show his surprise at how good it all tasted. When he complimented her, she simply nodded her thanks and began clearing the dishes. "You do not have to do that tonight," he said. "You must be exhausted from traveling." "I prefer to keep busy," she replied, and there was something in her voice that suggested this was not just a preference but a necessity. The days developed their own rhythm. Nora rose before dawn to start the stove and have coffee ready when Michael came in from the early chores. She attacked the neglected house with the same quiet determination she brought to everything. And within a week the windows gleamed, the floors shone, and the vegetable garden had been weeded and coaxed back to productivity. She baked bread on Mondays and Thursdays, did laundry on Tuesdays, and spent her evenings mending clothes by lamplight in the parlor. Michael found himself timing his return to the house to coincide with her presence in the kitchen. He told himself it was just because the coffee was always fresh and hot, but he knew he was lying. He liked the way she hummed while she worked, soft melodies he did not recognize. He liked the efficiency of her movements, nothing wasted, everything purposeful. He liked the rare moments when she forgot to guard her expressions, and he caught glimpses of the woman beneath the careful exterior. 3 weeks into her employment, he came in to find her standing at the kitchen window, tears streaming silently down her face. She wiped them away quickly when she heard his boots on the floor, but not quickly enough. "Miss Mitchell," he said gently. "Nora, are you all right?" "I am fine," she said automatically, turning back to the stove. "Supper will be ready shortly." "Nora." He crossed the kitchen slowly, the way he would approach a skittish horse. "You do not have to tell me what is wrong, but please do not insult either of us by pretending nothing is." Her shoulders shook once, a tremor she could not quite control. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It has been a month since my aunt died. A month since I had anyone in the world who knew my name, who cared whether I lived or died. Some days the loneliness is so heavy I can barely breathe." Michael felt something crack open in his chest. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. After my mother passed, I would walk through this house and feel like a ghost in my own life. Everything familiar but nothing the same. She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and he saw recognition in her eyes. Here was someone who understood loss not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing weight. "Thank you," she said, "for being honest." "Thank you for staying," he replied. "This house has felt like a home again since you arrived." Something shifted between them in that moment, a door opening just a crack. They did not speak of it directly, but Michael noticed Nora's smiles came more easily after that. She began joining him on the porch after supper, sitting in the rocking chair while he smoked his pipe and watched the sun set behind the mountains. They talked about small things at first: the health of the cattle, the progress of the garden, the gossip Tom brought back from town. But gradually, the conversations deepened. Nora told him about growing up in a boarding house in Sacramento, the daughter of a widow who took in laundry. She described the way she had worked her way into domestic service, learning everything she could, saving every penny. She spoke of her aunt with genuine affection, but also with the weariness of someone who had spent years caring for an invalid. Michael told her about his parents, his father's dream of building something lasting in Nevada, his mother's homesickness for Missouri that had never quite faded. He confessed his fear that he was not good enough to maintain what they had built, that the ranch would fail and prove he had been unworthy of their sacrifice. "That is foolish," Nora said bluntly one evening in mid-July. They were watching heat lightning flicker on the horizon, the air thick with the promise of rain that might never come. "This ranch is thriving. Anyone can see that. The cattle are healthy, the land is well managed, and you treat your workers fairly. What more do you think you owe them?" "To be the man my father was," Michael said. "You are not your father," Nora replied. "You are yourself. That has to be enough." He looked at her then, really looked at her in the fading light, and felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. She had loosened her hair from its usual severe style, and it fell in waves around her shoulders. Her face had lost some of its guardedness, and there was color in her cheeks from the sun. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was real and present and solid in a way that made him feel less alone. "Nora," he said, and then stopped because he did not know how to finish the sentence. She met his gaze, and he saw his own longing reflected back at him. But she stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt. "I should go in. There is bread to prepare for tomorrow." He let her go, but he lay awake that night thinking about the way she had said his name earlier that evening, soft and familiar, like a prayer or a promise. August brought a heat wave that turned the valley into an oven. The cattle grew listless, and Michael and the hands spent long days ensuring they had enough water. Nora took to preparing cold suppers and leaving pitchers of sweetened water on the porch. She wore lighter dresses, and Michael tried not to notice the curve of her neck, or the way perspiration made her skin glow. One afternoon, Ricardo came running to the house, shouting for Michael. One of the heifers was in difficulty with her calf, stuck in a gully about a mile from the house. Michael grabbed his rifle because a cow in distress could attract predators and rode out hard. By the time he returned, it was full dark, and he was covered in mud and blood. The calf had survived, but it had been a near thing. He led his exhausted horse into the barn and began the work of rubbing him down, not wanting to bring his filth into the house. Nora found him there an hour later. "Tom told me what happened. Is the calf all right?" "Yes, but it was close. Another hour and we would have lost both of them." She moved into the barn, carrying a lantern that cast shadows across the walls. "You look exhausted. I will clean up and be in shortly. Michael." There was something in her voice that made him turn. She set the lantern down carefully and walked toward him. "You take care of everything and everyone. Who takes care of you?" "I manage," he said, but his voice sounded rough even to his own ears. Nora reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his jaw. "You do not always have to manage alone." He caught her hand, held it against his cheek. "Nora, I have to tell you something. These past 2 months having you here, it has been more than just having help around the house. You have become important to me, more important than I have any right to say." "Why do you have no right?" she asked softly. "Because I hired you, because you depend on me for your livelihood, because if I am wrong about what I think I see in your eyes, I will have made everything impossibly awkward." She smiled then, a real smile that lit up her whole face. "You are not wrong." He kissed her then, pulling her close despite the mud and blood, and she kissed him back with an intensity that spoke of all the lonely nights and careful distance they had maintained. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said. "Maybe I have been since that first day at the station." "I know," she whispered. "I have been falling too. I kept telling myself it was foolish, that I was just grateful for the work and the kindness, but it is more than that. You make me feel seen in a way no one ever has before." They stood together in the barn for a long time, holding each other while the horses shifted in their stalls and the night sounds of the ranch filtered through the walls. Finally, Nora pulled back, laughing a little. "You need a bath," she said. "You smell like a swamp." "Romantic," he teased, but he was grinning like a fool. "Go," she said, pushing him gently toward the door. "I will heat water for the tub." Everything changed and nothing changed. They were more careful around Tom and Ricardo, not wanting to invite gossip, but in the privacy of the house, they allowed themselves small intimacies. Michael would rest his hand on the small of Nora's back as he passed her in the kitchen. She would adjust his collar before he went out to work, her fingers lingering on the fabric. They sat closer together on the porch in the evenings, their chairs pulled side by side, sometimes holding hands in the darkness. In late August, they drove into Genoa for supplies. Michael helped Nora down from the wagon outside the general store, and she took his arm as they walked inside. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the store with her husband, gave them a knowing look. "Good to see you, Mr. Murphy. And this must be your housekeeper everyone has been talking about." "Miss Mitchell," Nora said evenly, extending her hand. "Of course." Mrs. Patterson shook her hand but continued to smile in that way that suggested she suspected there was more to the story. "We do not get many single young women settling in Genoa. You must find it lonely." "On the contrary," Nora replied smoothly. "I find it quite peaceful." As they gathered supplies, Michael was aware of the attention they drew. Genoa was a small town, and newcomers were always subjects of interest. But there was something else in the looks they received, a speculation that made him uncomfortable. When they left the store, he helped Nora load the supplies, then turned to her. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I should have thought about how this would look, bringing you to town together." "How what would look?" Nora asked, genuinely confused. "People will talk. About you living at the ranch with only me and the hands. About us being unmarried." Nora's expression hardened. "Let them talk. I have done nothing improper and neither have you. If small minds want to make small assumptions, that is their concern, not mine." He loved her even more in that moment for her fierce pride. But as they drove back to the ranch, he found himself thinking about the future. Summer was waning. In another month, the heat would break and the days would grow shorter. He had hired Nora for the summer season only. What happened when autumn came? That night, after supper, he found Nora in the garden pulling weeds from around the squash plants. He joined her, working in comfortable silence until the shadows grew long. "I have been thinking," he said finally, "about when summer ends," her hands stilled in the dirt. "I have been thinking about that too. Your agreement was through September, Michael continued. But the ranch does not stop needing care when autumn comes. If anything, there is more work to be done preparing for winter. I would like you to stay on, permanently if you are willing. Nora sat back on her heels, looking at him carefully. As your housekeeper? Yes, no. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with his own inability to say what he meant. Nora, I want you to stay because I cannot imagine this place without you anymore. I want to come in from the cold and find you in the kitchen. I want to sit with you in the evenings and tell you about my day. I want to wake up knowing you are here, that you are part of this place, part of my life. Michael, she said softly, and he heard both joy and caution in her voice. What exactly are you asking? He knelt beside her in the dirt, taking her hands in his. I am asking you to marry me. I know it is fast, and I know there are 100 practical reasons why you might say no. But I love you, Nora Mitchell. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you hum when you think no one is listening. I love how you have made this house a home again. I want to build a life with you if you will have me. Tears spilled down her cheeks, catching the last light of the day. I never thought anyone would want that with me. I thought I would spend my life moving from one position to another, always serving someone else's family, never having one of my own. Is that a yes? He asked, hardly daring to breathe. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears. Yes, Michael Murphy, I will marry you. He kissed her there in the garden with dirt on their hands and joy in their hearts. When they finally went inside, he drew her into the parlor and they sat together on the sofa, making plans. They would marry quickly, quietly, at the church in Genoa. Tom and Ricardo could stand as witnesses. Afterward, there would be no grand honeymoon, just the continuation of the life they had already begun building together. Are you certain? Nora asked, her head resting on his shoulder. You could find someone younger, someone from a good family with a dowry. I do not want someone younger or richer, Michael said firmly. I want you, exactly as you are. They were married on a golden September morning with the aspens beginning to turn yellow in the mountains. Nora wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, and Michael wore his best suit. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a traveling Methodist preacher who happened to be passing through Genoa. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Michael kissed Nora with a gentleness that promised a lifetime of tenderness. Tom and Ricardo threw rice as they left the church, whooping and hollering until Nora blushed and Michael laughed. They had dinner at the hotel, a celebration meal that lasted through the afternoon. Other ranchers and townspeople stopped by their table to offer congratulations, and Michael felt a swell of pride at being able to introduce Nora as his wife. When they returned to the ranch that evening, Michael carried Nora over the threshold even though she protested. She was too heavy. He set her down gently in the parlor and took both her hands in his. I know this is not the grand romance you might have dreamed of as a girl, he said. No fancy house in San Francisco, no life of leisure. This is better, Nora interrupted. This is real. This is ours. They made love that night with the windows open to let in the cool air and the sound of coyotes singing in the distance. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Michael's bed, which was now their bed, and talked until the moon rose high above the mountains. I was afraid, Nora confessed in the darkness. When I got on that train in San Francisco, I was so afraid. I had no idea what I was coming to, no certainty that you would even be a decent man. I just knew I had to leave, had to try something different. I am glad you were brave, Michael said, pressing a kiss to her temple. I am glad you took that chance. Autumn transformed the valley into a patchwork of gold and rust. Michael and the hands moved the cattle to the lower pastures and began the work of preparing for winter. Nora threw herself into preserving the garden's harvest, filling the pantry with jars of pickles and tomatoes and peaches. She made soap and candles, mended winter clothes, and helped Michael repair the chicken coop before the first snow. In October, they received a letter from Mrs. Crawford, Michael's great-aunt, expressing her delight at the marriage. She had known what she was doing when she sent Nora to Nevada, she wrote, and she had hoped things would work out exactly as they had. Nora laughed when she read the letter, shaking her head at the old woman's matchmaking. "We have been manipulated," she told Michael. "Expertly," he agreed, grinning. "Remind me to send Aunt Crawford a very nice Christmas present." November brought the first real snow, blanketing the valley in white. Michael worried about the cattle, but Tom assured him they had weathered worse winters. Inside the house, Nora kept the fires burning and the meals hot. She taught Michael to play chess on long evenings, and he taught her the card games his father had favored. They talked about expanding the ranch, maybe adding sheep in the spring. They talked about children, both hoping and uncertain, knowing that such things came in their own time. On Thanksgiving, they invited Tom and Ricardo to dinner in the house, a feast that Nora had been preparing for days. There was turkey and dressing, sweet potatoes and green beans, pies and cakes and fresh bread. As they sat around the table, Michael looked at the faces gathered there and felt overwhelming gratitude. This was family, cobbled together from loneliness and chance, but family nonetheless. "I want to say something," he announced, raising his glass of cider. "A year ago, I sat alone in this house and wondered how I would manage another winter. I felt like I was slowly disappearing, like the cold and the work and the loneliness were going to erase me bit by bit. Then Nora arrived and everything changed. She brought light back into this place, back into my life. So I am thankful. For her, for all of you, for this moment right here." "Here, here," Tom said gruffly, and Ricardo nodded, blinking suspiciously bright eyes. Nora reached over and squeezed Michael's hand. "I am thankful too," she said quietly, "for being found when I did not even know I was lost." December brought brutal cold and fierce winds that howled down from the mountains. Michael spent more time indoors, catching up on bookwork and making plans for spring. He loved these forced periods of stillness, loved the excuse to stay close to Nora and the warmth of their home. She was teaching herself to knit from a book she had ordered from a catalog, and her first attempts were charmingly lopsided. "I am making you a scarf," she announced one evening, holding up something that looked more like a tangle of yarn than anything functional. "It is beautiful," Michael said diplomatically. "It is a disaster," Nora corrected, but she was laughing. "I will get better, eventually." For Christmas, Michael gave Nora a locket with a tiny photograph of the two of them taken in Genoa by a traveling photographer. She cried when she opened it, fastening it around her neck immediately. She gave him a new saddle blanket she had woven herself, the pattern intricate and perfect, and he marveled at the skill of her hands. On New Year's Eve, they bundled up and walked out into the snow, standing together under a sky so clear and full of stars it seemed impossible. Nora tipped her head back, her breath clouding in the cold air. "I never want to forget this," she said. "How happy I am right now in this moment." "We will have many more moments like this," Michael promised, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Years and years of them." "I hope so," she whispered. "I hope we grow old together right here, watching the seasons change." January brought news that made their hopes feel more concrete. Nora realized she was expecting a child. She told Michael one morning over breakfast, her hands shaking slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "I was not certain at first," she said, "but now I am. We are going to have a baby, Michael, sometime in late summer, I think." He stood so quickly his chair fell backward, crossing to her in 2 strides and pulling her into his arms. "Truly?" Truly, she confirmed, laughing at his reaction. He kissed her thoroughly, then knelt and pressed his ear to her still flat stomach as if he might hear something already. "Hello in there," he said softly. "I am your father, and I already love you more than I knew was possible." Nora ran her fingers through his hair, overcome with emotion. They had made a family, something neither of them had been certain they would ever have. The baby would be born into love and security, would grow up knowing the ranch and the mountains, would have parents who chose each other and chose this life deliberately. The winter seemed longer with the anticipation of the baby, but also sweeter. Michael became even more protective, insisting Nora rest more and take on fewer chores. She tolerated his fussing with good humor, knowing it came from love. Tom and Ricardo were equally delighted by the news, and Ricardo began carving a cradle from pine wood, his hands shaping something beautiful from raw lumber. In February, a blizzard trapped them inside for 3 days. The world beyond the windows disappeared into white, and Michael worried about the cattle. But Tom had moved them to the sheltered pastures before the storm hit, and they were as safe as they could be. Inside, Michael and Nora passed the hours reading aloud to each other, playing games and planning the nursery. "I want our child to know stories," Nora said one afternoon, curled against Michael on the sofa. "I want to fill this house with books and imagination and possibility." "We will," Michael promised. "We will give this baby everything we can, love most of all." When the storm finally broke, the world emerged transformed. Snow drifted higher than the porch railings, and the sun on the white landscape was blinding. Michael and the hands spent days digging out paths and checking on the herd. They lost a few head, which hurt, but most had survived. It could have been so much worse. March brought the first hints of spring. The snow began to retreat up the mountains, and Nora's belly began to swell noticeably. She was radiant with pregnancy, her skin glowing and her movements taking on a dreamy quality. Michael could not stop touching her, his hand drawn to the growing curve of their child. One evening, he felt the baby kick for the first time. They were in bed, Nora reading and Michael drowsing beside her when she grabbed his hand and pressed it firmly to her side. There, unmistakable, was a tiny thump against his palm. "Did you feel it?" Nora asked, her face alight with wonder. "I felt it," Michael confirmed, tears in his eyes. "Our baby, strong already." They stayed like that for a long time, waiting for more kicks, marveling at the miracle of the life they had created together. April brought busy days as the ranch roared back to life after winter. Calving season meant long hours and little sleep for Michael and the hands. Nora, now visibly pregnant, managed the house and worried about Michael wearing himself too thin. She made sure he ate properly and got at least a few hours of rest each night, her love expressed through practical care. Tom and Ricardo remained respectful and supportive, treating Nora with the gentle deference they might show a sister. When Ricardo presented the finished cradle in May, Nora cried over its beauty. He had carved animals into the headboard, a deer and a hawk and a bear, with mountains rising behind them. "For the baby to dream of Nevada," Ricardo explained, his English heavily accented but his meaning clear. "It is perfect," Nora said, hugging him impulsively. "Thank you." June arrived with heat and sunshine, and the first anniversary of Nora's arrival. Michael marked the date by taking her on a picnic to a meadow filled with wildflowers. She was 7 months pregnant now, moving carefully, but determined to enjoy the day. "A year ago, I stepped off that train not knowing anything about what was to come," Nora said, leaning back against Michael's chest as they sat in the grass. "If someone had told me then that I would be sitting here now, married to you and carrying our child, I would not have believed them." Best decision I ever made, Michael said, his hands resting on her belly. Offering you work for the summer. Best decision I ever made was accepting, Nora replied. She was quiet for a moment, then added softly, I cannot imagine going back to that loneliness now. I cannot imagine winters without you. You will never have to, Michael promised. We have built something here, Nora, something lasting. This is just the beginning. July brought scorching heat that made Nora uncomfortable in her advanced pregnancy. Michael set up a bed for her on the screened porch where it was cooler, and she spent her afternoons there, sewing baby clothes and watching the ranch go about its business. Dr. Hensley from Genoa came out to check on her, pronouncing both mother and baby healthy and predicting a delivery sometime in late August. First babies have their own timeline, he said kindly. Could be a few weeks earlier or later. Just take it easy and send for me when the time comes. Michael became obsessive about making sure everything was ready. He stocked extra food and medical supplies. He made sure the wagon was in perfect working order in case they needed to get Nora to town quickly. He drove Nora and Tom crazy with his preparations until Nora finally sat him down and took his face in her hands. Michael, I am not the first woman to have a baby, and I will not be the last. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. Everything will be fine. I cannot lose you, he said, his voice breaking. Nora, I cannot. You will not, she said firmly. I am strong, and this baby is strong, and we will both come through this. You have to trust that. He wanted to believe her, but fear gnawed at him. He had known too much loss already. His parents, his dreams of having family close by, all of it taken too soon. The thought of losing Nora was unbearable. In mid-August, 2 weeks before the baby was due, Nora's pains began in the middle of the night. She woke Michael calmly, her hand on his shoulder. It is time, she said simply. Michael was on his feet immediately, lighting lamps and pulling on his clothes. He sent Tom racing to Genoa for Dr. Hensley, then returned to Nora. She was walking the length of the bedroom, one hand pressed to her lower back, breathing through the contractions. Tell me what to do, Michael said, feeling helpless. Just stay with me, Nora replied. That is all I need. You with me. He stayed with her through the long hours that followed. He held her hand and wiped her face with a cool cloth. He walked with her when she needed to move and supported her when she needed to rest. When the pains grew intense and she cried out, he felt each cry like a knife to his heart, but he did not leave her side. Dr. Hensley arrived as dawn was breaking, Ricardo riding alongside Tom. The doctor examined Nora and pronounced everything progressing normally, which gave Michael some relief. But the labor continued through the morning and into the afternoon, and Michael watched Nora's strength wane with each passing hour. She is exhausted, he told Dr. Hensley. Can you do something? She is doing exactly what she needs to do, the doctor replied calmly. First babies take time. She is strong. Have faith. As the sun began to set on the longest day of Michael's life, Nora gave a final tremendous effort, and their child entered the world with a lusty cry. Dr. Hensley held up a squirming, red-faced baby, and Michael felt his knees go weak with relief. A boy, the doctor announced. Congratulations, Mr. Murphy. Michael looked at Nora, who was crying and laughing at the same time, her arms reaching for their son. When Dr. Hensley placed the baby in her arms, cleaned and wrapped in a soft blanket, Michael thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. A son, Nora whispered, looking down at the baby with wonder. Michael, we have a son. He sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping his arms around both of them. What should we name him? They had discussed names, but nothing had felt quite right until now. Nora looked at the baby thoughtfully, then at Michael. Matthew, she said. Matthew Henry Murphy, after your father Henry and my father Matthew. Perfect, Michael agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Hello, Matthew. Welcome to the family." The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Matthew was a good baby, healthy and alert, with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair. Michael found himself utterly transfixed by every tiny movement, every sound. He would stand over the cradle for long minutes, watching Matthew sleep, overcome by the fierce protectiveness of new fatherhood. Nora took to motherhood with the same capable grace she brought to everything. She nursed Matthew and soothed him and seemed to know instinctively what he needed. But Michael made sure she was not alone in it. He changed nappies and walked the floor with Matthew when he was fussy. He brought Nora meals in bed and took over the baby so she could rest. "You are a natural at this," Nora told him one morning, watching him expertly burp Matthew after a feeding. "I am terrified every second," Michael admitted. "But I love it. I love him. I love you. I love all of this." September brought cooler weather and the beginning of another autumn. Matthew was growing, filling out and becoming more alert. He would track movement with his eyes and had started smiling, particularly at his father's voice. The ranch settled into new rhythms that accommodated the baby, and Tom and Ricardo were frequent visitors to the house, both besotted with the infant. "He will grow up knowing horses before he can walk," Tom predicted, holding Matthew awkwardly but carefully. "Be running this ranch before he is 10. "He can be whatever he wants to be," Nora said firmly, "as long as he is happy and kind." October brought the anniversary of their wedding and a celebration that was quiet but meaningful. Michael gave Nora a rocking chair he had been secretly building in the barn, perfect for nursing Matthew or sitting in the nursery. She gave him a leather journal for recording the ranch's business, with his initials tooled into the cover. "I want you to write down our story," she said, "so that Matthew will know someday how we met, how we fell in love, how we built this life." "I will," Michael promised. Every important moment. Winter came again, but this time it felt different. The house rang with baby sounds, Matthew's cries and coos and the sweet sound of Nora singing lullabies. Michael no longer dreaded the long, dark months. Instead, he welcomed the excuse to stay inside with his family, to sit by the fire with Nora and Matthew, to simply be present in their life together. On Christmas Eve, they stood together in the parlor, looking at the small tree Michael had cut and decorated. Matthew was asleep in Nora's arms, his tiny fist curled against her chest. Snow was falling gently outside the windows, and the house was warm and filled with the smell of baking and pine. "You remember what you said last New Year?" Michael asked softly. "About wanting to remember how happy you were." "I remember," Nora replied, looking up at him. "I need you to know something," Michael continued. "Last winter I said I could not imagine winters without you, and that is still true, but it is more than that now. I cannot imagine any season without you. Spring or summer, autumn or winter, every day is better because you are in it. You and Matthew, you are my whole world." Tears slipped down Nora's cheeks. "You gave me everything I thought I could never have," she said. "A home, a family, a place to belong. I was so lost when I came here, Michael, and you found me." "We found each other," he corrected gently, leaning down to kiss her forehead, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "Two lonely people who got impossibly lucky." The years that followed were not without their challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, cattle lost to disease and crops that failed. There were nights when Matthew was sick and they sat up worrying, and days when the work seemed endless. But through it all, Michael and Nora faced everything together, their love deepening with each shared struggle and triumph. When Matthew was 2, Nora gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, called Maggie from the start. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. 2 years after that came another son, Samuel, who was quiet and thoughtful from birth. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the chaos of children, and Michael could not have been happier. Tom retired when Matthew was 5, moving into Genoa to live with his sister, but he visited often. Ricardo stayed on, becoming foreman and eventually bringing his own bride to the ranch, a widow from Carson City with 2 children of her own. The ranch grew and prospered, adding more land and more cattle, becoming one of the most successful operations in the valley. But success was never the point for Michael and Nora. The point was the life they had built, the family they had created, the home they had made together. On warm summer evenings, they would sit on the porch while the children played in the yard, and Michael would reach for Nora's hand, marveling that he got to live this life. When Matthew was 12, old enough to understand, Michael gave him the journal he had been keeping. It was filled with the story of how Michael had offered Nora work for the summer and ended up finding the love of his life. He had written about that first glimpse of her at the station, about the way she had slowly let down her walls, about the night in the barn when they had finally admitted their feelings. "This is your history," Michael told his son. "This is how your family began." Not with anything grand or dramatic, but with 2 people who needed each other and were brave enough to take a chance. Matthew read the journal carefully, then looked at his parents with new understanding. "You were both alone before," he said. "We were," Nora confirmed, sitting beside Michael on the porch. "And then we were not. That is the miracle of it. Years continued to pass. The children grew and eventually left to make their own lives, though they always came home for holidays and important occasions." Matthew took over more of the ranch operations as Michael's hair turned gray. Maggie became a teacher in Genoa, married a banker, and had children of her own. Samuel studied veterinary medicine and returned to the valley to practice, much to his parents' delight. On the 50th anniversary of Nora's arrival in Nevada, Michael and Nora stood together in the same meadow where he had taken her for their first anniversary picnic. They were both old now, their bodies marked by time and work, but their hands still fit together perfectly. 50 years, Nora said wonderingly. "How did it go so fast?" "I do not know," Michael admitted, "but I would not trade a single moment. Even the hard times, even the sad times, they were all part of this beautiful life we built." "Do you remember what you said to me once?" Nora asked. "About not being able to imagine winters without me." "I remember everything," Michael replied. "Every conversation, every moment. You gave me a life worth remembering, Nora Murphy." "We gave each other that," she corrected. 2 lonely people who found each other at exactly the right time. They walked back to the house slowly, their steps measured but steady. The ranch spread around them, still thriving, still home. Their grandchildren would be arriving soon for the celebration, and the house would once again fill with noise and love and the continuation of the family story. That evening, surrounded by 3 generations of family, Michael raised his glass for a toast. "To Nora," he said, his voice still strong despite his years, "who got off a train 50 years ago and changed my entire world. Who made a house into a home, who gave me children and grandchildren, who showed me what love really means. Every single day with you has been a gift. To both of you," Matthew added, raising his own glass, "for showing us what a real partnership looks like, what real love looks like." "To family," Maggie said. "To home," Samuel added. "To us," Nora said softly, looking at Michael with the same love that had been there 50 years ago in the barn in the garden on that first evening when they admitted what was growing between them. "To the life we made." They lived several more years together, Michael and Nora, growing old in the house where they had built their family. When Michael finally passed at the age of 86, Nora held his hand and told him she would see him again soon. She followed him less than a year later, her body simply deciding it was time to rest. They were buried side by side in the cemetery in Genoa, their graves marked with a simple stone that read, Michael Murphy, 1857–1943, and Nora Murphy, 1858–1944. Below their names, at the request of their children, was inscribed, two souls who found each other when they needed it most. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through Matthew and then his children. The house was carefully maintained, and the story of how it all began was told to each new generation. The tale of how Michael offered Nora work for the summer, and how that simple act of kindness became a love story that shaped an entire family. On summer evenings, when the light hits the valley just right, when the mountains turn purple and gold in the sunset, some say you can still feel their presence. In the way the wind moves through the grass, in the warmth that lingers in the house, in the enduring strength of the love they built together. A love that started with loneliness and chance, grew through trust and tenderness, and lasted through every season, every challenge, every joy. It was not a grand romance by the world's standards. There were no ballrooms or fancy parties, no wealth or social position. But it was real and true and deep. It was two people choosing each other every single day, building something lasting out of honesty and work and hope. It was a rancher who needed help and a woman who needed a home, finding in each other everything they had been missing. Years after Nora's death, when Matthew was an old man himself, he would sit on that same porch and tell his own grandchildren the story. He would describe how his father had stood on the train platform that hot June day in 1885, uncertain and hopeful. How his mother had stepped down from that train, brave and desperate for a fresh start. How they had circled each other cautiously, finding friendship first, then love, then a partnership that became the foundation of everything that followed. The thing you have to understand, Matthew would say, his voice carrying the same gentle wisdom his father had possessed, is that they saved each other. Your grandmother always said she was lost when she came here, and your grandfather would say he was fading away before she arrived. Together they became whole. That is what real love does. It does not complete you because you were never incomplete, but it makes you better, stronger, more yourself than you could be alone. The story became legend in the family, passed down with pride. It was told at weddings and anniversaries, used to remind younger generations that the best things in life often come from taking chances, from being open to possibility, from seeing past the surface to the person underneath. The house still stands in the valley outside Genoa, Nevada, weathered but strong. The mountains still rise behind it, snow-capped in winter and golden in summer. The land still supports cattle and horses. And though Michael and Nora are long gone, their love remains, woven into the very fabric of the place, as much a part of the landscape as the sagebrush and the stones. It was, in the end, a simple story. Man offers woman work. Woman accepts. They fall in love. They build a life. But simple does not mean small. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones with the deepest roots, the ones that create legacies lasting generations. Sometimes offering someone work for the summer leads to a love that transcends seasons, that makes winters unimaginable without the warmth of that other person beside you. In the growing darkness of that first evening, when Michael had watched Nora efficiently prepare their supper and felt the stirring of something he did not yet have a name for, he could not have known how it would all unfold. He could not have predicted the joy and the sorrow, the children and grandchildren, the 50 years of partnership that would follow. But he knew, even then, that something important had begun. And Nora, standing at that stove in a strange kitchen, in a house in the middle of nowhere, with a man she had just met, felt it too. The sense of possibility, the whisper of hope, the first fragile thread of connection that would eventually become unbreakable. They were two people alone, and then they were two people together, and that made all the difference. Not just for them, but for everyone who came after, everyone who benefited from the love they built and the example they set. They proved that family is not just about blood but about choice, about showing up, about doing the work day after day even when it is hard. The last journal entry Michael made before his death was simple. It read, "Another year with Nora. Another year of waking up beside her, sharing meals with her, watching the sunset from our porch. How did I get so lucky? How did I deserve this life? I am grateful beyond words for every moment, every season, especially the winters, particularly the winters." And that really was the heart of it. He had offered her work for the summer, never imagining it would lead to a lifetime of love. He could not imagine winters without her because she had become as essential to him as breath, as necessary as the ground beneath his feet. She was his home, his partner, his best friend, his love. And he had been the same for her. In the end, that is what their story proved. That love is not always lightning and thunder. Sometimes it is quiet and steady, built moment by moment through small acts of kindness and care. Sometimes it is two lonely people who take a chance, who let down their walls, who choose to trust again despite past hurt. Sometimes it starts with something as simple as offering work for the summer and becomes something so profound that even death cannot diminish it. Their story ended as all stories must, with the closing of eyes and the stilling of breath. But what they created together, the love they shared and the family they built, that continued. In their children and grandchildren, in the stories told around dinner tables, in the ranch that still bears the Murphy name, in the love that others found inspired by their example. Michael and Nora Murphy, who met by chance in 1885, who married that same year, who spent 50 years building a life together in Nevada, who proved that sometimes the best things come from the simplest beginnings, who showed that real love is not about grand gestures but about showing up every day, through every season, through easy times and hard. The summer he offered her work, he gained a lifetime. The winters without her, after she was gone, were as unimaginable as he had always feared. But he had no regrets, only gratitude for every single day they had together. And when his own end came, his last thought was of her, of that first glimpse at the train station, of all the moments between then and now, of the extraordinary ordinary life they had shared. That is the story of Michael Murphy and Nora Mitchell Murphy, written here so it will not be forgotten, preserved so future generations will know how it all began. With a telegram, a train, a dusty ranch in Nevada, and two people brave enough to take a chance on something new. Two people who found in each other everything they had been looking for, even when they had not known they were looking at all. And if you visit Genoa, Nevada, even now, and drive out into the valley where the Murphy Ranch still stands, you might understand what made their love so special. The stark beauty of the landscape, the endless sky, the way the mountains hold the valley like cupped hands. It is a place that demands resilience, that requires partnership, that rewards those strong enough to put down roots. Michael and Nora were strong enough. Together, they were more than strong enough. And the life they built there, starting with that single summer, proved to be everything either of them had ever hoped for and more than they had dared to dream. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.